Lean in close. This is a story of a world where power is the only currency that matters. In these lands, a single glance can shatter a destiny, and a heartbeat can signal the end of an era. Imagine a man, his forehead pressed against hers, not in a moment of soft romance, but in a claim of absolute, terrifying possession. This is the chronicle of a bond that defies the laws of their reality. Here, strength is measured in dominance, and weakness is a death sentence. For years, the hierarchy has remained ironclad, built upon the bones of those who dared to hope for something more. But the universe is a volatile force. It waits for the precise moment when the pressure becomes unbearable. Then it strikes. It brings together two souls who have no business meeting, let alone surviving one another. One is a king who rules with a blade-sharp temper. The stage is set. The players are moving into position. And in a world where love is the most dangerous power of all, the rules are about to be rewritten. Deep within the Rapid River Pack, existence was a cycle of sharp edges and heavy hands. Audrey lived at the bottom of this hierarchy, a position that invited constant, casual cruelty. To the others, she was not a person. She was a target. Every day began with the threat of a shove or a stinging blow. She moved through the pack grounds with her head down, learning to anticipate the shift in a shoulder or the tightening of a fist. She cleaned the communal spaces, hauled heavy loads, and absorbed the verbal barbs that were meant to keep her small. When a task was finished, another was forced upon her, often accompanied by a kick to the ribs or a sharp command. She became a fixture of the pack, a world-worn bruise that everyone felt entitled to press. She learned to hold her breath, to minimize her presence, and to accept that pain was the only constant she could rely on. When the pack finally retreated to their dens, Audrey sought the perimeter of the territory. She climbed the ridge where the wind bit into her skin, seeking a sliver of space that belonged only to her. She looked up. For years, the stars had been her only witnesses, cold points of light that watched her endure the daily grind. But tonight, she did not look for guidance. She did not look for a sign. She stared into the vast, indifferent dark and felt the weight of her own history pressing down. She traced the lines of her palms, mapping the calluses and the lingering aches, and realized the hope she once held had evaporated. It was not a sudden loss, but a slow, grinding erosion. She had spent too long believing that she was a broken object, a piece of life that could never be mended. She stopped searching the horizon for a future. She stopped listening for a voice that might offer kindness. She stood on the edge of the world, convinced that love was a language spoken in a country she would never visit. The stars remained, but they were distant, unreachable, and entirely silent. She turned her back on the sky, walked down the slope, and accepted that she was destined to remain in the shadows, unloved and entirely alone. Miles away, the atmosphere in the moonlight Eclipse throne room was brittle. Lucas sat upon the dais, his fingers drumming a rhythmic, impatient beat against the stone armrest. He watched his advisors scramble to present reports, but his eyes remained fixed on the heavy oak doors. He stood abruptly, the movement causing the court to fall into an immediate, suffocating silence. He paced the length of the hall, his boots striking the marble with a force that echoed through the rafters. When an advisor dared to stutter a question, Lucas turned, his gaze narrowing until the man recoiled. He did not shout. He simply gestured toward the exit, his hand trembling with a barely contained, jagged irritation. The advisor fled. Lucas returned to the throne and gripped the stone until his knuckles turned white. He possessed the authority to command. The search had spanned a decade. Lucas had crossed every border, visited every pack, and stood in every court from the northern tundra to the southern coasts. He kept a map of his travels, a sprawling document marked with ink and blood, now pinned to his study wall. He ripped it down. The paper tore under his grip, scattering across the floor. He had been told that a mate was a destiny, a biological anchor, but he had found only empty beds and hollow promises. He walked to the window, watching the moonlight cut across the courtyard. He remembered the first year, when he had traveled with a heart full of expectation. By the 5th year, that expectation had curdled into a cold, hard cynicism. He had interrogated elders, consulted ancient scrolls, and even tracked rumors of fabled bloodlines, only to find nothing but folklore. He slammed his fist against the stone frame, the impact vibrating through his arm. Was he cursed to rule a kingdom of shadows, forever denied the one soul meant to balance his own? The frustration was a constant, low-burning fire in his gut. He grabbed a decanter and shattered it against the hearth, the glass shards skittering across the floor like teeth. He was done with the myths. He was done with the waiting. If the world would not provide him with an answer, he would force the world to yield one. He turned from the wreckage, his decision made, and began to prepare for the ball. The annual Lunar Eclipse ball was a gauntlet of gold and vanity. The ballroom stretched wide, its ceiling lost in shadow, while the floor groaned under the weight of thousands. Every surface shimmered with excessive wealth, reflecting the arrogance of those who walked upon it. Alphas from every corner of the continent gathered here, their presence marked by a heavy, cloying scent of dominance and ego. They moved in tight circles, chests puffed, voices booming with practiced superiority. The air was thick with the heat of too many bodies and the sharp tang of expensive wine. Waiters wove through the crowd, ignored by the elite who were too busy measuring each other's status. There was no room here for the weak, and certainly no room for the forgotten. The music was a relentless, rhythmic thrum that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards, designed to drown out any thought that did not serve the status quo. It was a sea of polished surfaces and sharpened teeth. Every laugh sounded like a challenge, and every glance was a calculated assessment of power. In this gilded cage, the atmosphere was suffocating. Far from the golden center of the room, the shadows pooled against the cold stone walls. Audrey pressed herself into the deepest recess of a pillar, her pulse a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She kept her chin tucked, eyes fixed on the floor, watching the polished boots of the elite click past. Every time a group of alphas approached, she held her breath, willing the darkness to swallow her whole. She was a ghost in this hall of giants, a flicker of movement that no one bothered to track. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white as she fought the urge to bolt. The noise of the crowd was a physical weight, a roar of laughter and boastful declarations that made her head spin. She felt the sharp edge of a stone carving digging into her shoulder, a painful reminder of her reality. She was not meant to be here, and the fear of discovery was a cold knot in her stomach. She shifted her weight, trying to find a position that didn't ache, but the floor was unforgiving. She watched the sea of faces, searching for a path to the door. She was invisible, she told herself. But as the music swelled, the shadows began to fray. Just feet away from her pillar, a circle of high-ranking alphas stood with their backs to the wall. Their voices were loud, cutting through the music with jagged, arrogant edges. One man gestured broadly, his hand slamming against a marble pedestal to emphasize a point about territorial expansion. They spoke of power as if it were a commodity to be traded, their laughter harsh and devoid of warmth. Audrey listened, unable to look away, as they traded insults about rival packs and dismissed the lower ranks as mere tools. One alpha sneered, his eyes scanning the room with a predatory glint that made Audrey flinch. He spoke of omegas with a casual, biting cruelty, describing them as disposable assets that existed only to be controlled. The others nodded, their agreement a chorus of entitlement that filled the space between them. The air grew heavy with the scent of their aggression, a suffocating musk that seemed to press against Audrey's lungs. She watched as they toasted to their own perceived superiority, their movements fluid and practiced. Every word they uttered was a reminder of the hierarchy that kept her trapped. The air in the ballroom felt stagnant, heavy with the scent of vanity and stale wine. Then, the massive oak doors groaned against their hinges, swinging inward with a force that echoed through the stone chamber. The music, which had been a relentless, pulsing rhythm, sputtered and died in an instant. A sudden, sharp draft swept through the hall, extinguishing the candles nearest the entrance and plunging the threshold into a brief, flickering gloom. The collective chatter of the crowd vanished, replaced by a vacuum of sound so absolute it made the ears ring. Every head in the room turned toward the doorway, as if pulled by a single, invisible wire. The floorboards beneath the entrance seemed to groan under a new, immense pressure. No one spoke. No one moved. The arrogance that had defined the room only seconds before dissolved, replaced by a sudden, chilling stillness. Lucas did not rush. He stood at the threshold, his posture perfectly still, yet his eyes were in constant, rhythmic motion. He scanned the ballroom with the cold, calculated focus of a predator surveying a trapped herd. His gaze did not linger on the gold-leafed walls or the ornate chandeliers. It cut through the crowd, dissecting the room layer by layer. When his eyes swept over the high-ranking alphas, they instinctively shifted their weight, their bravado evaporating under his scrutiny. He was not looking for a conversation or a greeting. He was hunting. Every movement of his head was precise, a slow rotation. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized a group of pack leaders. They fell silent, unable to meet his stare. The air grew thin, charged with the static of his intent. He was dissecting the room, marking the space. He took one step forward, the sound of his boot hitting the marble floor echoing like a gavel strike. He was moving toward the shadows. The ballroom floor felt like a gauntlet, yet Lucas moved as if the crowd were nothing more than static. He walked past the rows of bowing heads, his gaze fixed on the periphery where the light failed to reach. Suddenly, he stopped, his head tilted, a sharp, bird-like motion that cut through the silence of the hall. He inhaled, his chest expanding with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The scent hit him, not the cloying perfumes of the court. It was the sharp, clean smell of rain hitting hot pavement, layered with the delicate, wild sweetness of lilies. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, his nostrils flaring as he traced the invisible thread through the heavy atmosphere. His eyes snapped open, glowing with a sudden, intense clarity. He turned, his body pivoting with a fluid, predatory grace. The hunt had ended. The reality had begun. He took a single, heavy step toward the darkness, his focus absolute and unyielding. The distance between them ceased to exist. When their eyes finally met, the ambient roar of the ballroom, the clinking glass, the murmurs of the court, the music simply evaporated. It was as if a vacuum had been pulled over the room, leaving only the two of them in a silent, pressurized space. Audrey felt her breath hitch, caught in her throat like a jagged stone. She tried to look away, to retreat further into the dark, but his gaze acted like an iron tether. It was a collision of forces that left no room for evasion. Her pulse hammered against her ribs, a frantic, irregular rhythm that she could feel in her fingertips. She stood frozen, her muscles locked, while a fine, uncontrollable tremor began at her knees and worked its way up her spine. The intensity of his focus was a physical weight, pressing against her senses until she felt exposed, stripped of every wall she had spent years building. She was a deer caught in the sudden, blinding glare of a hunter's light. Her hands gripped the edge of a nearby pillar, her knuckles turning white as she fought to stay upright. The world had stopped spinning, and in the stillness, she realized with a jolt of pure, raw terror that there was nowhere left to run. He did not blink. His eyes moved over her with the precision of a surgeon, ignoring the crowd that swirled around them like insects. He saw the way she held her shoulders, hunched to minimize her presence. He saw the faint, jagged lines of old marks on her skin, the physical history of a life spent in the shadows. Each scar told a story of neglect, a map of the pain she had endured while the world looked the other way. His gaze was not merely observant. It was a physical force that seemed to touch the very places she had tried to keep hidden. He cataloged the tension in her jaw, the way her chest rose and fell in shallow, jagged bursts. The hunger in his expression sharpened, shifting from the curiosity of a predator to something far more dangerous. It was a possessive, absolute recognition. He saw the depth of her isolation, and with every second that passed, the air around him grew heavy, charged with a dark, protective energy. Audrey felt his eyes tracing the lines of her suffering. She wanted to shrink, to vanish, but his focus held her fast. The stillness shattered. Lucas shifted his weight, and the floorboards groaned under the sudden, concentrated pressure of his stride. He began to move. It was not a walk. It was a deliberate, predatory advance that carved a path through the suffocating density of the ballroom. With every heavy step, a rhythmic thud echoed against the stone walls, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the crystal chandeliers above. The guests in his path did not merely move aside. They stumbled, pushed back by the sheer force of his intent. He ignored them all, his focus locked entirely on the girl against the pillar. The floor seemed to tilt toward him as he crossed the distance, the wood beneath his feet bowing under the raw, kinetic energy he radiated. Each stride was a seismic shift, a slow-motion demolition of the space between them. He did not rush, yet he covered ground with terrifying speed, his posture rigid and his movements fluid. The air in the room grew thin. Audrey watched him come, her back pressed so hard against the stone that it bruised, while the rhythmic vibration of his approach traveled through the foundation. The path to her was suddenly severed. 3 men from the Rapid River Pack stepped into the gap, their movements sharp and dismissive. They did not bow. They stood with their chests puffed out, hands resting on their hips, blocking the line of sight between the king and the girl. One of them spat on the floor near her feet, a deliberate act of degradation. He gestured toward her with a flick of his chin. "Don't waste your time, Your Highness," he sneered, his tone dripping with casual cruelty. "She is just a broken omega, a useless thing that barely pulls its own weight, not worth a second of your attention." The others laughed, a harsh, grating sound. They stood firm, their bodies creating a wall of muscle and arrogance. They did not see the way the light died in his eyes. Lucas stopped. He did not look at them, not at first. He kept his head tilted, his gaze fixed on the girl behind them. Then, slowly, he turned his head. The air in the immediate vicinity dropped in temperature, turning sharp and biting. The silence was not empty. It was heavy, pressurized, and waiting to detonate. Lucas did not speak. He did not need to. A low, guttural vibration began deep in his chest, a sound so primal it bypassed the ears and settled directly into the marrow of everyone present. It started as a hum, a rhythmic tectonic shift that caused the crystal glasses on nearby tables to chime and tremble against the wood. The men who had blocked his path faltered, their sneers faltering as the sound grew in volume and intensity. It was the sound of a predator claiming territory, a raw, territorial growl that seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the ballroom. The air grew thick, charged with a static intensity that made the skin prickle. Every guest in the room froze, caught in the wake of the sound. The floorboards beneath the feet of the pack members groaned under the sudden, focused pressure of his rage. The growl deepened, turning into a constant, thrumming roar. Lucas stood motionless, his focus absolute, as the sound continued to swell, turning the air into a suffocating shroud of pure, unadulterated dominance. The room was a vacuum, drained of all motion and sound, save for the relentless, thrumming vibration of the king's rage. It was a sound that demanded total submission, a frequency that made the very walls seem to bow inward. Audrey stood at the center of the storm, her hands pressed against her sides, her knuckles white. The weight of the atmosphere was crushing, a physical pressure that made every inhalation a struggle. She felt the eyes of the entire room, 1,000 gazes heavy with judgment, but it was the king's focus that pinned her in place. Her breath hitched, trapped in a throat constricted by sheer, paralyzing dread. Then, the tension reached a breaking point. A tiny, thin whimper escaped her lips, a sound so small it was almost lost. Yet, to Lucas, it was a clarion call. The king's eyes flared, his pupils dilating until the iris was swallowed by shadow. The final thread of his control snapped. He was moving. He moved with the velocity of a falling star. The space between the king and the pack members vanished in a single, blurred heartbeat. The first man to reach out was met with a forearm strike that sent him spinning backward, his feet leaving the floor as he collided with a stone pillar. The impact echoed like a hammer on an anvil. Lucas did not stop, did not pivot, and did not hesitate. He plowed through the line of bodies as if they were made of dry leaves. Another man lunged, fingers clawing for purchase, but Lucas caught his wrist and twisted, the force of the motion throwing the man aside into the sea of gold-clad guests. Tables shattered under the weight of the bodies crashing into them. Crystal shards rained down, glittering in the air before hitting the floor in a chaotic spray. The air was filled with the sound of splintering wood and the sharp, sudden gasps of the crowd. There was no grace in this movement, only raw, unbridled momentum. By the time he reached the center of the room, the men were scattered. He stood alone, his chest heaving, eyes locked onto the target. The distance between them evaporated. Lucas did not walk. He crossed the floor in 2 long, predatory strides that left the marble floor vibrating beneath his boots. Audrey braced herself, her heels digging into the stone, but the momentum of his arrival was absolute. He reached her before she could draw a full breath. His hands, large and calloused, moved with the precision of a trap closing. He did not hesitate, and he did not ask. He hooked his arms around her, one at the small of her back and the other beneath her knees, and lifted. The world tilted violently. Her feet left the ground, and in a single fluid motion, she was hauled upward. The impact of her body against his was jarring, a collision of solid muscle and warmth that knocked the remaining air from her lungs. He pulled her flush against his chest, his grip iron tight, leaving no space between them. She felt the heavy, rhythmic thud of his heart against her ribs, a drumbeat of raw intensity that drowned out the murmurs of the room. She was no longer standing in the shadows. She was held, anchored, and entirely contained within his reach. He held her as if she were the only solid thing. The ballroom fell into a vacuum of sound. Every guest, every noble, every rival alpha stood frozen, their gazes locked on the 2 figures at the center of the floor. Lucas did not look at them. He looked through them. He shifted his weight, his boots grinding against the marble, and turned slowly to survey the room. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and impending violence. His chest rose, a deep, rhythmic expansion that signaled the gathering of immense force. He tightened his hold on Audrey, his fingers pressing into her back, anchoring her to him. The silence stretched, becoming a physical weight that pressed against the eardrums. Then he opened his mouth. The sound that erupted was not merely a shout. It was a guttural, primal vibration that tore through the stagnant air. It hit the walls like a physical blow, rattling the chandeliers and sending a tremor through the very foundation of the hall. The roar was a declaration of absolute ownership, a sound of pure territorial rage that stripped away every pretense of status in the room. When the sound finally faded, the silence that remained was absolute, hollow, and terrified. He had spoken, and the hierarchy of the world had been shattered. The echo of the roar died against the vaulted ceiling, but the vibration lingered in the marrow of every person present. No one moved. The air in the ballroom felt thin, stripped of its previous arrogance. Guests who had stood tall moments ago now hunched their shoulders, their eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards. The hierarchy that had governed this room for decades had dissolved in an instant. Lucas did not release his hold. He stood in the center of the floor, his presence a wall of immovable force that demanded total submission. He scanned the room, his eyes moving with a slow, deliberate pace that forced heads to bow further as he passed. Every alpha who had previously dismissed the girl in his arms now retreated, taking half steps backward to widen the distance. The silence was not merely an absence of noise. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of fear. No one dared to whisper. No one dared to breathe too loudly. The power dynamic had shifted. He remained perfectly still, his jaw set, waiting for a challenge that he knew would never come. Against the backdrop of the terrified room, the world narrowed down to the space between them. Audrey felt the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. It was not just a physical barrier. It was a furnace of heat that radiated through her, defying the cold dread that had defined her existence for so long. She pressed her palms flat against him, intending to push away, but her fingers curled into the fabric instead. Beneath her touch, she felt it, a heartbeat. It was deep, slow, and powerful, a rhythmic thud that resonated through her own ribcage. It was the heartbeat of a predator, yet it was steady, lacking the jagged, frantic pace of her own terror. She tried to steady her breathing, but the scent of him rain on hot pavement and wild lilies was overwhelming, grounding her in a way she could not comprehend. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but the warmth of his hold was a gravity she could not escape. She felt the rise and fall of his lungs, a slow, deliberate cadence that demanded she match his rhythm. The fear was still there, a sharp, icy needle in her gut, but it was being slowly eclipsed by a sensation she had never known. She was trapped, yet for the first time in her life, she was not alone. She tilted her head back, the movement stiff and unnatural. Her throat felt constricted, as if the very air she breathed were too thick to allow for speech. She looked up, but her gaze skittered away from his eyes, unable to sustain the intensity of his focus. Her hands, still pressed against him, trembled with a violence that made her skin ache. She needed to speak, to break the crushing weight of the moment, but the words felt foreign, trapped behind a lifetime of being told she was nothing. She swallowed hard, the movement visible in the hollow of her throat. She tried to pull back, to create a sliver of space between them, but his hold remained absolute. It was a cage of warmth that offered no exit. She forced her lungs to work, pushing the air past her vocal cords until a sound finally emerged. "Your Highness," she whispered, the words catching on a jagged breath. "I am sorry, but there must be a mistake." She waited for him to release her, for the reality of her insignificance to finally assert itself. She was a broken thing, a relic of a life spent in the dirt, and the idea that she could be anything else felt like a cruel trick of her own desperate mind. She braced herself for the rejection, for the moment he would realize his error and cast her aside. Lucas did not loosen his hold. Instead, his fingers dug deeper into the space between her shoulders, pulling her even closer until there was no air left between them. He did not look at the room, nor at the pack members who stood frozen in the periphery. His gaze remained locked on her, burning with a singular, terrifying clarity. He leaned down, his forehead pressing firmly against hers, a physical anchor that forced her to meet his eyes. When he spoke, the sound did not just travel through the air. It vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the glass in the chandeliers above. There was no hesitation in his tone, no room for debate. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice a low, resonant growl that silenced the remaining murmurs in the hall. "There is no mistake." He shifted his weight, his stance widening, a predator claiming his territory against the entire world. "I have spent years searching for a myth, and I have found my queen." He looked past her then, his eyes sweeping the room with a cold, lethal promise. "You are mine," he stated, "and I will burn this world to the ground before I let anyone touch you again." The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against every person present. Lucas stood at the center of the room, his posture rigid, his presence dominating the space. He swept his gaze across the assembled pack members, his eyes hard and unyielding. "The laws you have lived by," he began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "are dead." He took a single, heavy step forward, the sound of his boot against the floor echoing like a gavel. "They are relics of a broken system that thrives on cruelty and silence. As of this moment, they hold no power here." He felt the tension in the room spike, a collective intake of breath from those who dared not challenge him. He did not care. He turned his attention back to the space he occupied, his hands moving with deliberate protective intent. "I am not here to negotiate," he stated. "I am here to dismantle the foundations of this society if that is what is required to ensure her safety." The ballroom remained frozen, a tableau of shock and sudden, sharp realization. The air felt thin, stripped of its previous arrogance, replaced by the heavy, vibrating reality of the king's vow. Lucas did not release his hold. He kept his gaze fixed on the doors, daring any soul in the room to challenge his claim. One by one, the alphas who had once stood tall began to lower their eyes, stepping back into the shadows they had previously commanded. The power dynamic had shifted in a single heartbeat, and the room knew it. Audrey stood within the circle of his arms, the pulse of his heart against her own, serving as the only steady rhythm in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. She looked toward the exit, the path forward obscured by the weight of what he had just promised to destroy. This was not merely a moment of rescue. It was the catalyst for a seismic shift in their reality. The path ahead is paved with fire and uncertainty, a journey where every step threatens to reshape the landscape. The laws of the past have crumbled, leaving only the raw, unyielding truth of their connection. This is only the beginning of a legend. Stay close. Consider the nature of a flame. It provides warmth, yet it consumes everything it touches. This is the reality of what they have ignited. It is not a gentle affection, nor a quiet companionship. It is a collision of two forces that refuse to be contained by tradition. Love, in this world, is not a soft thing. It is a weapon. It is a shield forged in the heat of absolute, uncompromising devotion. When a king decides that the world must bend to his will for the sake of one person, the resulting shockwave alters history itself. Audrey, once invisible, now stands at the epicenter of a storm that will tear down kingdoms to ensure her survival. Lucas, once hollow, now finds his purpose in the destruction of his own status quo. They are bound by a tether that ignores the laws of men. The air remains heavy with the scent of change. The path they walk is narrow, jagged, and unforgiving. Yet, the truth becomes undeniable. This is the most dangerous power of all, a love that refuses to be denied, even if it means burning the entire world to the ground. The echoes of his roar finally died away, leaving only the sound of their synchronized breathing in the vast, still room. Lucas did not look at the crowd. He looked only at her. In that gaze, the entire history of his hollow life seemed to dissolve, replaced by a singular, burning focus. Audrey met his eyes, the terror of the moment giving way to a strange, grounding clarity. She saw the truth in his expression, a promise of protection that defied every law she had ever known. The world around them remained, but it had become irrelevant. The golden ballroom, the whispering onlookers, the rigid hierarchies of their packs, all of it faded into a blurred backdrop. They stood as the only 2 points of reality in a shifting landscape. A slow, steady tension held them together, a tether that felt as permanent as stone. Outside the windows, the moon hung heavy and silver, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor. The air was thick with the scent of rain and wild lilies, a lingering signature of their union. As the light in the room began to dim, their connection remained the only constant, a silent vow that would outlast the night. The future was unwritten, a dark and jagged path ahead, but they faced it as one. The image of the king and his queen held for a heartbeat longer, a final, silent testament to the storm they had unleashed.